Before kings wore crowns, they hung their power on the wall. Tonight we trace the slow meditative pull of ancient threads, the first looms, and the tapestries that told the world who ruled it. Find a comfortable position. Let your eyes grow heavy, and let history carry you softly into sleep. If the gentle voices of history help you rest, subscribe and ring the bell. New episodes drift in every week. There is something quietly astonishing about the idea that, long before any human being pressed a reed into wet clay to scratch out the first symbols of written language, long before the earliest alphabets were dreamed into existence, long before any scribe bent over a papyrus scroll in lamplight, someone was already weaving. The loom is older than the word, older than the sentence, older, in fact, than most of what we typically call civilization, though that word itself becomes slippery and uncertain the moment we press it against evidence this ancient. We tend to think of civilization as something that arrived with cities, with kings, with monuments that could be seen from a distance. But the loom suggests a different kind of sophistication entirely, one that was intimate rather than monumental, domestic rather than imperial, quiet rather than loud. The loom suggests that the impulse to create order from chaos, to take loose and unruly natural fibers and impose upon them a repeating, intentional structure, is something far older and far deeper in the human story than we sometimes remember. The earliest evidence for weaving takes us back approximately 7,000 years, to the civilizations that grew along the banks of great rivers, the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Around 5000 BCE, in those warm and fertile river valleys, where the first dense human settlements were taking root, the loom was already a familiar object, already in some sense ancient. We know this not because anyone wrote it down, writing would not appear for another 2,000 years, but because of what archaeologists find when they dig carefully and patiently through the layers of earth that time is pressed down over these earliest human homes. They find spindle whorls, the small weighted discs that were used to spin raw fiber into thread. They find the impression of woven cloth pressed into dried mud, a ghost of textile surviving in negative where the cloth itself long ago dissolved. They find bone needles and loom weights, the small stones or clay pieces that were hung from the bottom of an upright loom to keep the warp threads taut and even. They find, in other words, not the looms themselves. Wood does not last 7,000 years in most climates, but the entire supporting cast of objects that only make sense if a loom was present. To understand what those first looms looked like, we have to think ourselves back into a world without metal tools, without standardized measurements, without any of the inherited technical knowledge that we take entirely for granted. The earliest looms were almost certainly ground looms, sometimes called horizontal looms, which were exactly as simple as that name implies. Two parallel beams of wood were laid flat on the ground, held apart at a fixed distance by stakes driven into the earth, and the warp threads, the long vertical threads that form the structural backbone of any woven cloth, were stretched tightly between them. A weaver would then sit or crouch at one end and pass the weft thread, the crosswise thread, over and under alternate warp threads, row by patient row, building up the fabric from one end toward the other like a very slow tide coming in. It was work that required no complex machinery, no sophisticated engineering, no materials that could not be gathered from the immediate natural world. It required only thread, 2 sticks, some stones, and time. It required, above all, patience, a quality that the earliest human communities, whose survival depended on the slow and attentive observation of seasons, weather, plants, and animals, had in abundance. What those first weavers were working with was almost certainly flax in Egypt and linen-producing plants in Mesopotamia, with cotton appearing somewhat later in the Indus Valley civilization. Flax is one of the oldest cultivated plants in human history, and its transformation into linen cloth is a process of almost poetic tedium. The stalks must be harvested at exactly the right moment, then retted, soaked in water for days or weeks to allow the outer casing to rot away, then dried, then broken and scutched and hackled, each step separating the long, silky inner fibers from the woody outer ones, until finally what remains is a bundle of fine, lustrous filaments that can be spun into thread. This whole process, from field to fiber, could take months. And then the spinning, and then the weaving. A single piece of fine linen cloth represented an almost incomprehensible investment of human labor and human time. This is worth pausing on because it changes how we understand what cloth meant in these early societies. We live in a world of cheap, abundant textiles, a world where fabric is so inexpensive and so plentiful that we throw it away without much thought. The ancient world was precisely the opposite. Cloth was wealth. Cloth was status. Cloth was, in a very real and practical sense, a form of currency, one of the most reliable and portable forms of stored value that early economies possessed. In ancient Egypt, linen was used to pay taxes, to compensate workers, to make offerings to the gods. Temple storerooms were stacked with bolts of cloth the way a modern treasury might be stacked with gold. When archaeologists excavate the tombs of wealthy Egyptians, they find not just gold and jewels, but fabric, carefully folded, sometimes inscribed with the name of the deceased, preserved for eternity as a marker of earthly wealth. The loom, in this sense, was not merely a craft tool. It was a machine for producing value, for converting the labor of human hands and the patience of human hours into something durable and exchangeable and real. The women who worked those earliest looms, and it was overwhelmingly women, in virtually every ancient culture we know of, occupied a paradoxical social position that is worth examining carefully. On one hand, weaving was domestic work, household work, the kind of work that is so foundational and so constant that it becomes invisible, unremarked upon, taken for granted. On the other hand, the economic importance of weaving was so enormous that it could not be entirely suppressed or denied. In ancient Mesopotamia, the great temple complexes of and Lagash maintained industrial-scale weaving workshops employing hundreds of women, many of them slaves or dependent laborers, producing cloth for trade and for the maintenance of the temple's enormous economic apparatus. These women are recorded, however briefly and bureaucratically, in the clay tablets that temple administrators use to keep track of labor and rations. They are listed by name, sometimes by skill level, sometimes by the type of cloth they were assigned to produce. They are, in the most literal sense, the first textile workers whose existence is documented in writing. And the documentation exists not because anyone thought their lives were worth recording for their own sake, but because the cloth they produced was too valuable not to track. In ancient Egypt, the picture is somewhat different. Egyptian tomb paintings, those vivid, flat, endlessly informative windows into daily life along the Nile, frequently depict weaving scenes. And in the earlier periods of Egyptian history, those scenes show horizontal ground looms worked by women in domestic settings. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, a new type of loom had appeared in Egypt, the vertical or upright loom, in which the warp threads hung downward from a horizontal beam supported by two upright posts. This innovation allowed weavers to work standing up rather than crouched on the ground, which was both more comfortable and more efficient for certain types of work. It also, intriguingly, opened the door to a broader range of decorative techniques, because a vertical warp was easier to work with colored threads and complex patterns. The tapestry, as a distinct art form, would eventually grow from this vertical tradition. But the loom story in these ancient river valley civilizations is not only a story about economics and labor, important as those dimensions are. It is also a story about something harder to quantify, about the relationship between repetitive physical work and the human mind, about what happens to consciousness when the hands are busy with a task that is demanding enough to require attention, but familiar enough to allow the mind a certain gentle freedom. Every weaver who has ever worked at a loom, in any century and any culture, knows this quality of the work, the way the rhythm of it, the shuttle passing through the shed, the beater pressing each new row of weft firmly against the last, the shuttle passing back, the beater again, becomes almost meditative after a time. The hands learn the pattern and begin to move with a kind of autonomy, and the mind, no longer needed to supervise every individual motion, is free to drift and wander and think its own thoughts. It is not passive, this state. It is something more like alert relaxation, a condition in which the body is productively occupied while the mind is gently, pleasantly unmoored. We cannot know what the weavers of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia thought about as they worked. We cannot know what stories they told each other across the loom, what songs they sang, what memories moved through their minds as their fingers found the familiar path of the thread. But we can know, because human neurology has not changed in 7,000 years, that the rhythmic, repetitive nature of weaving would have produced in them something very like what it produces in weavers today: a gentle dampening of anxiety, a quieting of the restless and effortful parts of cognition, a sense of time passing in a way that is neither wasted nor hurried but somehow exactly right. The loom, long before anyone thought to theorize about it, was a technology for achieving a particular quality of mind. This is perhaps why weaving appears so often, in so many different mythological traditions, as a metaphor for something more than cloth-making. The Fates in Greek mythology were weavers. The Norse Norns were weavers. The Hindu goddess Maya, whose name means both illusion and the creative power of the universe, is associated with weaving. Across cultures and centuries, human beings have returned again and again to the image of the loom as a way of describing how the world itself is made. Thread by thread, row by row, in a pattern too large and complex to be seen all at once. Built up slowly from the crossing and recrossing of individual filaments into something that holds together, that has texture and warmth and weight. The fire-lit rooms in which those first weavers worked are worth imagining in some detail, because the physical setting shaped the experience of the work in ways that matter. In the ancient world, before any form of artificial lighting more powerful than an oil lamp or a rushlight or an open fire, almost all fine handwork, sewing, spinning, weaving, was done either in direct sunlight or by firelight. The quality of firelight is entirely different from the quality of electric light. It is warm and directional and slightly unsteady, casting moving shadows and pools of brightness that shift as the fire breathes. It illuminates the hands and the work immediately in front of the weaver, but leaves the rest of the room soft and dim. It creates an atmosphere that is, almost despite itself, intimate and enclosed. A circle of warmth and light in the surrounding darkness. A small human territory carved out of the night. To work at a loom by firelight, with the crackle and smell of the fire in the background and the rough texture of the warp threads under the fingers and the slow accumulation of new cloth on the finished beam, was to inhabit a sensory world of extraordinary richness and quietness simultaneously. It was, by any reasonable definition, a beautiful way to spend an evening. And it was not solitary work, at least not usually. In virtually every ancient culture, weaving was communal activity. Women worked together in households and workshops and temple precincts, their looms arranged near each other, their conversations and silences shared. The social dimensions of this communal labor are impossible to fully recover, but they were surely significant. The loom room, the weaving hall, the domestic space where the threads came and went, these were places where knowledge was transmitted and gossip exchanged and grief quietly held and songs half remembered were sung again. They were, in a real sense, among the first spaces of sustained female intellectual and social life that we can point to in the historical record. The cloth that came off those looms carried in its fibers not just flax or wool, but conversation, memory, shared attention, the invisible weight of all those hours of human presence. It is a long way from a ground loom staked into the earth beside the Nile in 5000 BCE to the great tapestries that would one day hang in the throne rooms of medieval Europe, and yet the distance is not as great as it might seem. The fundamental technology, warp and weft, the crossing of threads at right angles, the slow accumulation of pattern and cloth, remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. What changed was scale, ambition, the introduction of new fibers and new dyes, the gradual elaboration of technique that allowed weavers to achieve ever more complex patterns and ever more vivid colors. But the loom itself, in its basic logic, was complete from nearly the beginning. The people who sat at those earliest looms in firelit rooms along the ancient rivers had, without knowing it, invented one of the most durable and consequential technologies in human history. They had found a way to take the loose and separate threads of the natural world and bind them together into something warm and strong and lasting. They had made cloth. And in making cloth, they had made, in some quiet and fundamental sense, the first version of everything that followed. Long before the first alphabet was scratched into stone, long before any human hand pressed a stylus, into soft clay to leave behind the wedge-shaped marks we now call cuneiform. Long before the Egyptians developed their elaborate system of pictorial signs that would one day be deciphered by a young Frenchman standing before the Rosetta Stone, human beings were already writing. They were writing in thread. They were writing in color and pattern and texture, in the over and under logic of the loom, in the deliberate placement of one colored fiber against another in sequences that carried meaning as surely as any alphabet, as any syllabary, as any system of marks on any surface that historians have ever agreed to call writing. We do not usually think of textiles as a writing system. The word writing implies marks on a flat surface, implies a technology of inscription, implies the kind of record that can be read by someone who was not present when it was made, and who may have lived centuries or millennia after the maker's death. Cloth seems too soft for that, too perishable, too domestic. And yet the evidence gathered from cultures spread across nearly every inhabited continent and spanning thousands of years of human history suggests that the impulse to encode meaning in woven pattern is not a peripheral or exotic human behavior, but something very close to universal. Wherever human beings have made cloth with any degree of technical sophistication, they have made cloth that means something beyond its practical function. They have made cloth that speaks, that identifies, that commemorates, that warns, that welcomes, that grieves. The reasons for this are partly practical and partly something deeper and harder to name. On the practical side, a woven pattern is not significantly more difficult to produce than a plain weave, provided the weaver already knows how to weave. Once a loom is set up and the warp threads are in place, the introduction of color and pattern requires only the addition of extra weft threads in different colors and the deliberate selection of which warp threads to cross them over and under. A skilled weaver who has internalized a pattern can reproduce it without any written instructions, passing it instead from hand to hand, from mother to daughter or master to apprentice, through the medium of demonstration and repetition. The pattern lives, in other words, not in any external record, but in the body of the weaver, in muscle memory and in the kind of spatial intelligence that comes from years of working with thread. This embodied transmission of pattern knowledge is one of the most ancient forms of cultural continuity that human communities possess, and it is almost entirely invisible to the historical record because it leaves behind no documents, no inscriptions, no monuments. It leaves behind only cloth. In the Andean civilizations of South America, this textile as language tradition reached perhaps its most elaborate and technically astonishing expression. The cultures of the Central Andes, the Wari, the Tiwanaku, the various regional traditions that preceded the Inca, and the Inca themselves, developed weaving practices of a complexity and refinement that have never been surpassed anywhere in the world. Andean weavers worked with alpaca and vicuña fiber, spun to a fineness that modern textile scientists have struggled to replicate with industrial equipment. They employed tapestry techniques that allowed them to achieve pattern densities of hundreds of color changes per square inch. They developed structures that exist nowhere else in the global textile tradition, double weaves in which two complete layers of cloth, each with its own distinct pattern, were interwoven in such a way that the two layers could be separated and the pattern on each would prove to be the mirror image of the other. These were not technical achievements made for their own sake, as demonstrations of virtuosity for its own sake. They were achievements in service of meaning. Every structural choice, every color, every repeated motif in an Andean textile was part of a communicative system that told those who could read it exactly where the cloth came from, who had made it, what ritual purpose it served, and what social position its wearer or owner occupied. The Inca took this textile communication system and integrated it into the administrative apparatus of one of the largest and most complex empires the pre-Columbian Americas had ever seen. The quipu, a device made of knotted strings suspended from a main cord, sometimes including hundreds of pendant strings in multiple colors, is the most widely known example of Andean textile record-keeping, and scholars have long recognized it as a system for encoding numerical information used to record census data, tribute tallies, astronomical observations, and the logistical information required to manage an empire that stretched for thousands of miles along the western coast of South America. But recent scholarship has pushed further than the numerical interpretation of the quipu. suggesting that the color patterns and structural variations in quipu strings may have encoded narrative and historical information as well. That the quipu was not merely a calculator but something closer to a library, a three-dimensional textile archive in which the entire recorded knowledge of the Inca state was stored in knotted wool. If this interpretation is correct, and the evidence is accumulating in its favor, then the conquest and destruction of the Inca Empire by Spanish forces in the 16th century was not merely a political catastrophe, but a literary one. The destruction of an entire written tradition, an entire way of knowing and recording, that we have only the faintest and most fragmentary ability to reconstruct. But we do not need to travel to the Andes to find textiles functioning as language. The tradition is present in varying degrees of elaboration in virtually every weaving culture the world has produced. In West Africa, the kente cloth of the Ashanti people of present-day Ghana is one of the most visually striking examples of a textile tradition in which pattern and color carry precise social and historical meaning. Kente is woven in narrow strips, on a specialized loom and then sewn together to form larger garments, and every pattern and color combination in the kente vocabulary has a name and a specific significance. Certain patterns are reserved for royalty and cannot be worn by commoners. Without explicit permission, certain colors carry associations with specific occasions: gold for royalty and wealth, black for maturation and intensified spiritual energy, green for growth and renewal, red for political and spiritual moods of heightened emotion. A person wearing kente is not simply wearing a beautiful garment. They are making a statement about who they are, what occasion they are marking, what community they belong to, and what values they wish to assert. The cloth is a text, and those who share the cultural context in which that text was produced can read it as fluently as any written document. In the textile traditions of Central Asia and the Middle East, similar systems of meaning operated through the medium of carpet and flat weave production. The tribal rugs of the Turkmen peoples of Central Asia, bold geometric designs in deep reds and blacks and occasional touches of ivory, contain within their repeating motifs a vocabulary of symbols that identified the tribe of the weaver, the subgroup within the tribe, and sometimes the specific occasion for which a rug was made: marriage rugs, tent door hangings, storage bags, and ceremonial trappings. Each had their own recognized forms and pattern vocabularies. A knowledgeable observer looking at a Turkmen rug could determine from its design alone an enormous amount about its origins and purpose, could read it, in other words, as a document of identity and social meaning. The same principle held across the broader carpet weaving traditions of Persia, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Afghanistan, where regional and tribal design traditions were distinct enough that scholars and merchants developed the ability to read the geographic and cultural origins of a rug from its colors, its border systems, its field arrangements, and its individual motifs with a precision that is frankly remarkable. Color, in all these traditions, was not merely decorative but deeply semantic, and the production of specific colors was accordingly treated as a matter of considerable importance and sometimes of closely guarded secrecy. Before the development of synthetic dyes in the 19th century, all textile colors came from natural sources: plants, minerals, insects, shellfish, and the knowledge of how to extract and fix these colors reliably on fiber was a specialized craft knowledge that could take years to acquire. The rich, saturated crimson, known as Tyrian purple, produced from the mucus of certain Mediterranean sea snails of the genus Murex, was so expensive to produce. Tens of thousands of snails were required to produce even a small quantity of bow. The dye and the process was extraordinarily labor-intensive and foul-smelling, that it became, in the ancient Mediterranean world, the color of ultimate power. To wear Tyrian purple was to announce a proximity to divinity and sovereignty that no other visual signal could quite match. Roman emperors regulated its use with legislation. Byzantine emperors were described as born into the purple, a phrase that was not merely metaphorical but referred to the actual purple-dyed chambers in which imperial births were meant to take place. The color was law. The color was authority. The color was written into the fabric of governance in a way that was entirely literal. In ancient China, a similarly rigorous system of color and pattern regulation governed the textile traditions of the imperial court. The dragon robe or longpao worn by the Chinese emperor was not simply a garment of exceptional beauty and craftsmanship. It was a cosmological document, a wearable map of the universe as understood by Chinese imperial ideology. The dragon motifs that covered it, typically 9 dragons arranged in specific positions on the garment, represented the emperor's authority over the natural and supernatural order. The 12 symbols embroidered on the highest-ranking imperial robes each carried specific symbolic weight: the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the dragon itself, the pheasant, and several others, each one a reference to a specific quality of imperial virtue or cosmic order. The number of claws on each dragon's foot, 4 for princes of certain ranks, 5 for the emperor himself, was a matter of strict regulation. To wear the 5-clawed dragon without authorization was a capital offense. The robe was, in the most literal sense, a political document, and to misread it or to fraudulently reproduce it was an act of treason. The ancient Peruvian, West African, Central Asian, Mediterranean, and Chinese examples all point to the same underlying reality: that human beings, wherever they have developed sophisticated weaving traditions, have consistently, and almost inevitably, developed alongside those traditions a vocabulary of textile meaning, a system for encoding identity, status, history, belief, and social position in the colors and patterns of cloth. This is not coincidence. It reflects something deep about the relationship between textile production and human social organization, something about the way that the loom, as a technology, naturally lends itself to the production of meaning rather than merely the production of fabric. Part of the reason for this is structural. Weaving is, at its core, a binary art. Every intersection of warp and weft is a choice. The weft thread either passes over the warp thread or under it. This over-under binary is not unlike the on-off binary of digital information, and it means that weaving is, in a mathematical sense, a remarkably efficient medium for encoding pattern. The number of distinct patterns that can be produced on even a relatively simple loom, with a modest number of warp threads and a limited palette of colors, is effectively unlimited for practical purposes. The loom is, in this sense, a pattern-generating machine of extraordinary generativity. And where there is pattern, there is the possibility of meaning, because pattern is precisely what the human mind is most disposed to perceive and to interpret. We are pattern recognition animals. We find meaning in repetition and variation, in the way a motif recurs with subtle differences, in the way a border interrupts and frames a field, in the way a color appears here and not there, in a distribution that feels intentional rather than random. The loom produces exactly the kind of structured variation that the human mind is primed to read as significant. There is also something more intimate about textile meaning than about the meaning encoded in stone inscriptions or papyrus documents. A textile is worn against the body or wrapped around it or spread beneath it. The document that a robe or a blanket or a carpet constitutes is not held at arm's length, read and then set aside. It is lived with. It is touched and smelled and moved in. It acquires the warmth and smell and wear of the body that inhabits it, and in doing so, it becomes something more personal and more ambiguous than any inscription on a monument. The meaning in a textile is not fixed and public in the way that monumental writing is fixed and public. It is negotiated, contextual, dependent on the shared knowledge of a community, and on the specific circumstances in which it is displayed, or worn. This gives textile meaning a particular quality of privacy within publicity. It is legible to those who share the context of its production, but opaque, or at best partially legible, to those who do not. It is this quality of insider legibility that made textiles such powerful markers of tribal and communal identity in cultures across the world. To wear the patterns of your community is to make yourself readable, instantly and unmistakably, to everyone who shares that community's visual vocabulary. And to encounter someone wearing unfamiliar patterns is to encounter, in the most concrete possible way, the fact of human difference. To see, written in thread, the existence of another world of meaning that you do not have the key to read. The textile, in this sense, was never simply a covering or a comfort or a form of wealth, though it was all of those things. It was a way of being known. a way of announcing to everyone within sight the answer to the most fundamental of social questions. Who are you? Where do you come from? What do you belong to? And what does that belonging mean? The thread spoke, and for thousands of years before writing gave us other ways to say these things, it was the thread, more than anything else, that told the story of who we were. There is a tendency, when we think about the ancient world, to imagine its grandest achievements in stone. We picture the pyramids rising from the desert plateau at Giza, the marble columns of the Parthenon catching the Athenian light, the vast ceremonial staircase of Persepolis carved with its procession of tribute-bearers frozen in eternal relief. Stone endures. Stone is what survives the millennia and forms substantial enough to inspire awe, to fill museums, to anchor our sense of what those civilizations were and what they valued and how they understood themselves in relation to the cosmos and to power. We have built our entire imaginative relationship with antiquity on what stone has preserved for us. And in doing so, we have, almost without realizing it, profoundly underestimated the role of cloth. Because alongside every stone monument, every carved relief, every painted tomb wall in the ancient world, there was cloth. There was an enormous, continuous, state-organized, economically critical apparatus of textile production that was in many ways more central to the daily operation of ancient civilization than any monument ever was. The pyramids were built once. The linen that the Egyptian state produced, regulated, distributed, offered to the gods, wrapped around its dead, paid to its workers, traded across the Mediterranean, and draped over the bodies of its living rulers, was produced every single day in workshops attached to palaces and temples, by weavers who were as much state employees as soldiers or scribes. The royal workshop was not a peripheral feature of ancient civilization. It was one of its fundamental institutions, as essential to the functioning of the state as the treasury or the granary, and in some respects indistinguishable from both. In ancient Egypt, the evidence for state-organized textile production is woven quite literally into the documentary record from the very earliest periods of literate history. The Egyptian word for linen, shes, appears in inscriptions dating to the Old Kingdom period, roughly 2700 to 2200 BCE, in contexts that make clear its economic and ritual importance. Temple inventories list quantities of linen with the same careful attention to detail that they devote to grain, cattle, and gold. Administrative papyri from the Middle and New Kingdom periods document the operation of royal weaving workshops with a bureaucratic thoroughness that reflects how seriously the state took this production. We know from these records that Egyptian royal workshops were substantial operations, employing dozens or sometimes hundreds of workers, and that they operated under the direct supervision of officials whose titles placed them within the administrative hierarchy of the palace or the temple, not in the lower registers of domestic or craft production. The distinction matters enormously. In many ancient societies, weaving was understood as women's domestic work, valuable but essentially private, belonging to the household economy rather than the public economy of the state. Egypt complicated this picture in several important ways. While much household weaving was indeed performed by women, the large royal and temple workshops employed both men and women, and the men who worked in these workshops occupied a recognized and respected professional status. New Kingdom tomb paintings from sites like Beni Hassan show male weavers working at horizontal looms, their bodies depicted with the careful attention to detail that Egyptian artists reserved for scenes of genuine economic importance. These were not marginal figures. They were skilled workers performing a function that the state recognized as essential, and the state's recognition expressed itself in the form of rations, housing, and a place within the organized labor hierarchy that made the great Egyptian administrative machine function. What these royal workshops produced was cloth of a quality that the rest of the ancient world could barely imagine. Egyptian royal linen at its finest was woven to a thread count that rivals or exceeds the finest cotton sheets produced by modern industrial machinery. The linen known as royal linen or fine royal linen in Egyptian texts was so sheer that ancient writers compared it to woven air, to the surface of still water, to the web of a spider. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and observed its customs with the mixture of admiration and bewilderment that Egypt typically inspired in foreign visitors, remarked on the extraordinary fineness of Egyptian linen with a specificity that suggests genuine astonishment rather than mere rhetorical decoration. To produce cloth of this quality required not only exceptional raw material, the finest flax, harvested at exactly the right moment and processed with painstaking care, but weavers of extraordinary skill working on looms set up with a precision and consistency that could only be maintained in a dedicated workshop environment over years and decades of continuous practice. This cloth was not made for ordinary use. The finest products of the Egyptian royal workshops were destined for three primary purposes, each of which illuminates a different dimension of the relationship between textile production and state power. The first was the clothing of the pharaoh and the royal household. The pharaoh's body was, in Egyptian theology, not merely a human body but the locus of divine power on earth, the point at which the human and the divine intersected, and through which the order of the cosmos was maintained. Everything that touched the pharaoh's body was accordingly freighted with significance. The linen that clothed him was ritually pure, produced under conditions of ritual cleanliness by workers who were themselves subject to purity regulations, and its quality was an expression not merely of royal wealth but of the pharaoh's divine status. To clothe the divine body in anything less than the finest cloth available was not merely tasteless but theologically wrong, a failure of the proper maintenance of cosmic order. The second destination for the finest royal linen was the cult statues of the gods housed in Egypt's great temples. Egyptian religious practice centered on the daily ritual care of divine images, washing them, anointing them, clothing them in fresh linen, and presenting them with food and drink offerings in ceremonies performed by priests who had undergone extensive ritual preparation. The linen used in these ceremonies was produced to specifications that were themselves religiously regulated, and the royal workshops that produced it were in this sense not merely economic enterprises but sacred ones, their output as ritually significant as any prayer or hymn. The connection between the royal household and the temples was in any case not a sharp one in Egyptian ideology. The pharaoh was both head of state and chief priest, and the resources of the palace and the temple were in practice deeply intermingled. The linen that clothed the king and the linen that clothed the gods came from the same workshops, supervised by the same officials, and represented the same fundamental assertion that Egypt's rulers controlled and directed the flow of sacred material wealth. The third destination was the tomb. Egyptian burial practice required the careful wrapping of the deceased in many layers of linen bandages and shrouds, a practice that was both practical — the linen helped to preserve the mummified body — and deeply symbolic, since the wrapping of the dead in linen was associated with the wrapping of the god Osiris, the mythological ruler of the dead, and with the hope of resurrection and eternal life. The quantity of linen consumed by Egyptian funerary practice was staggering. A well-preserved royal mummy might be wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandage, and elite non-royal burials, while less extravagant, still required substantial quantities of cloth. The linen stored in tomb goods included not only bandages, but complete garments folded and placed in the tomb as provisions for the afterlife, some of them inscribed with the name and titles of the deceased in a gesture that blurred the boundary between textile and document in exactly the way we have already encountered. In ancient Greece, the royal workshop tradition took a somewhat different form, shaped by the particular political and social structures of the Greek city-state. Greece did not have the centralized palatial economy of Egypt, with its vast bureaucratic apparatus and its direct state control of major industries. Greek political life was organized around the polis, the city-state, which was a far more diffuse and decentralized structure than the Egyptian state, and Greek textile production was, accordingly, more distributed across households and smaller workshop operations. And yet the association between fine weaving and the highest levels of social and political power was no less strong in Greece than in Egypt. It was simply expressed differently. The most famous expression of this association in Greek culture is the figure of Penelope in Homer's Odyssey, weaving and unweaving her great loom work as a strategy for maintaining her autonomy and her loyalty to her absent husband Odysseus. Penelope's weaving is both a practical stratagem. She promises to choose a new husband from among her suitors when she has finished weaving a shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, then unpicks her work each night to prevent the task's completion. and a profound symbolic statement about the relationship between feminine virtue, textile skill, and the maintenance of household order in the absence of male authority. That Homer chose weaving as the medium of Penelope's resistance is not accidental or arbitrary. In Greek aristocratic culture, skill at the loom was one of the defining markers of the noble woman, as characteristic of high birth and good breeding, as skill at arms was for the noble man. A woman who wove beautifully was a woman who had been raised properly, who understood her place in the household economy, who could be trusted to maintain the domestic order on which the larger social order depended. But Greek textile production was not purely domestic or purely feminine. The great Panathenaic festival held every 4 years in Athens included among its central rituals the presentation of a new robe, the peplos, to the cult statue of Athena, housed in the Parthenon. This robe was woven by a selected group of young women called Araphoroi and Ergastinai, who worked under the supervision of the priestesses of Athena over a period of years leading up to the festival. The peplos was decorated with scenes depicting the mythological battle between the Olympian gods and the giants, a subject with obvious political resonances in a city that understood itself as a bulwark of civilization against barbarism. The weaving of this robe was not a craft activity. It was a religious and political act of the highest order, performed at the center of Athenian civic and religious life, under the direct auspices of the state and the goddess. The loom, in this context, was as much a political instrument as any speech delivered in the assembly or any law inscribed on stone. In Persia, the Achaemenid Empire that reached its height under Darius and Xerxes in the 5th century BCE developed a tradition of royal textile production and display that drew on influences from across the enormous territory it controlled. From Egypt to the Indus Valley, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, and synthesized them into something distinctly its own. The ceremonial center of the Achaemenid Empire at Persepolis is known to us primarily through its extraordinary stone reliefs, but those reliefs themselves document the textile wealth of the empire with remarkable thoroughness. The processions of tribute bearers carved on the Apadana staircase show figures from every corner of the empire carrying textiles as offerings to the great king. Folded garments, rolled lengths of cloth, decorated hangings, alongside gold and silver vessels, exotic animals, and other luxury goods. Textile tribute was, in other words, as fundamental a component of imperial revenue as any other form of wealth. The Persian royal workshops produced textiles of a luxury and complexity that dazzled ancient observers and have continued to fascinate scholars ever since. Persian carpet and textile traditions, drawing on ancient Mesopotamian weaving practices, and combining them with influences from Central Asia, Egypt, and the Aegean, were famous throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greeks, who were simultaneously at war with Persia and deeply impressed by Persian cultural achievements, used the word barbarikos, foreign, to describe a type of richly patterned woven decoration that they associated with Persian and Eastern textiles without any of the pejorative connotations the word would later acquire. Persian textiles were not barbaric in the modern sense. They were the most sophisticated and visually elaborate cloth products that the ancient world had yet produced, and their influence on Greek, Macedonian, and eventually Roman textile aesthetics was enormous. The workshops that produced these textiles were directly attached to the royal household and supervised by officials of the palace administration. The Persian king's control over luxury textile production was both economic and symbolic, a way of ensuring that the materials through which imperial magnificence was expressed remained under royal control and could be deployed as instruments of diplomacy, reward, and display. Gifts of Persian royal textiles were among the most powerful diplomatic tools available to the Achaemenid court, sent to client kings and allied rulers as tokens of favor that were simultaneously beautiful objects, expressions of imperial generosity, and unmistakable assertions of Persian cultural and economic supremacy. To receive a garment from the Persian king's own workshops was to be drawn into the orbit of Persian power, to be clothed, quite literally, in the fabric of empire. What unites these three great ancient traditions, Egyptian, Greek, and Persian, is the recognition, expressed in different ways and through different institutional arrangements, that the control of fine textile production was inseparable from the exercise of political and religious power. The royal workshop was not a luxury, not an incidental feature of palace life that happened to produce beautiful things. It was a fundamental instrument of state, as essential to the maintenance of royal authority as any army or any treasury. It was the place where the raw materials of the natural world, flax and wool and silk, indigo and madder and saffron, were transformed by human skill and human labor into something that could clothe the divine, honor the dead, impress the living, and tell the world, in a language that required no translation, exactly who was in charge. The thread that came off those royal looms was not merely thread. It was power, made tangible and wearable and beautiful, produced in the workshops of the great and destined for the bodies of the greater still. It begins with a king, an aging king, already ill, already carrying in his body the knowledge of his own approaching death, seated on a throne and leaning slightly forward in the posture of a man delivering unwelcome news. Around him stand courtiers whose expressions, rendered in wool on linen by hands that have been still for nearly 1,000 years, convey something between anxiety and resignation. Outside the window of the palace, if the embroidered border is to be believed, a comet blazes across the sky, Halley's Comet, visible from England in April of 1066, which contemporaries understood not as an astronomical event, but as a portent, a message written in fire across the heavens by whatever powers governed the fate of kingdoms. The king is Edward, called the Confessor, last of the Old English line, and what he is doing in this opening scene is setting in motion a chain of events that will end with England changed beyond recognition, with a new language slowly displacing the old one, with a new aristocracy planted on top of an ancient one, with castles rising from the English earth like the stone signatures of conquest. He is, apparently, naming his successor, and the man he is naming, or possibly the man he is not naming, depending on which side of the argument you stood on in 1066, is the man whose commissioning of the great embroidered record of subsequent events may have given us the most extraordinary narrative textile in the history of the world. The Bayeux Tapestry is not, strictly speaking, a tapestry. This is a pedantic point and yet somehow an important one, because the distinction it marks illuminates something fundamental about what the object actually is and how it was made. A tapestry, in the technical textile sense, is a woven fabric, in which the decorative design is created during the weaving process itself, the colored weft threads building up the image as the cloth is made. The Bayeux Tapestry is an embroidery, a piece of plain woven linen fabric onto which the images and text have been applied after the fact, using wool threads worked with needles and a variety of embroidery stitches. The primary stitch used for filling the large colored areas of the figures and scenes is a technique called laid and couched work, in which long threads are laid flat across the surface of the fabric and then secured with small cross stitches, a method that is both efficient for covering large areas quickly and remarkably durable, as the 9.5 centuries of the tapestry's survival amply demonstrate. The outlines of figures and the fine details, faces, hands, the scales of chainmail, the feathers of birds, the lettering of the Latin text, are worked in outline stitch and stem stitch, giving them a crispness and definition that the filled areas with their slightly rough texture of laid threads pleasingly complement. This technical distinction matters because it tells us something about how the tapestry was made and by whom. Embroidery of this kind on this scale was a recognized specialty of Anglo-Saxon England. English embroidery, known throughout medieval Europe by the Latin term opus Anglicanum, English work, was famous across the continent for its quality, its technical sophistication, and the skill of its practitioners. English embroiderers, predominantly women working in workshops associated with convents and noble households, had for centuries been producing embroidered vestments, altar cloths, and liturgical furnishings of a quality that was exported as luxury goods to churches and courts across Europe. The Bayeux Tapestry, in its technique and its execution, is clearly the product of this tradition. Whoever commissioned it, and the most widely accepted candidate, is Odo of Bayeux, the half-brother of William the Conqueror and Bishop of Bayeux, who had both the motive and the resources for such a commission. Had it made in England, almost certainly in Kent, by English embroiderers working in their native tradition to tell a story about their own defeat. There is something quietly vertiginous about this fact once it settles in. The Norman conquest of England was, among other things, a catastrophe for the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the culture it had produced. Thousands of English nobles lost their lands, their positions, and in many cases their lives in the years following the Battle of Hastings in October 1066. The English language was pushed from the corridors of power, replaced by the Norman French of the new ruling class. English institutions, English laws, English ecclesiastical arrangements were all subject to revision and replacement by the conquerors. And yet the record of the conquest that has survived most vividly, most completely, most humanly, the record that allows us to see the faces of the men involved, to follow the story beat by beat from Edward's deathbed to Harold's death on the field at Hastings, was made by English hands, working English stitches in England, probably within a decade, or two of the events depicted. The conquered made the record of their own conquering. The embroiderers who stitched William's fleet crossing the Channel, who stitched the Norman cavalry charging the English shield wall, who stitched the arrow falling and Harold clutching it, his eye, or perhaps at the shaft buried in his chest, the iconography is genuinely ambiguous, were women whose world had been turned upside down by the events they were recording. What they thought about the work they were doing is, of course, entirely lost to us. The tapestry does not tell us what the embroiderers felt. It tells us only what they made. What they made is a strip of linen approximately 68 meters long and between 48 and 53 centimeters wide. Dimensions that have shifted slightly over the centuries as the fabric has been trimmed, repaired, and otherwise altered in the course of its long survival. This strip is divided into a central register, where the main narrative unfolds, and two narrow border registers above and below, which contain a mixture of decorative animals, fables drawn from the tradition of Aesop, and additional scenes that sometimes comment on or extend the action in the main register in ways that scholars have argued over for generations. The borders are not merely decorative. They are part of the text, part of the argument, part of the meaning, and reading the tapestry well requires attending to them with the same seriousness as the central narrative. The narrative itself covers the period from approximately 1064, when Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl and effectively the ruler of England in all but name during Edward the Confessor's declining years, travels to Normandy on a mission whose purpose the tapestry presents as ambiguous but whose consequences it presents as momentous, to the Battle of Hastings in October 1066 and its immediate aftermath. The story is told in 58 scenes. The precise numbering varies depending on how scene boundaries are defined, connected by a continuous flow of landscape elements and punctuated by Latin captions that identify characters, name locations, and occasionally characterize actions. It is this combination of sequential image and explanatory text spread across a long horizontal surface that has led modern observers to reach repeatedly for the analogy of the comic strip. Like a comic strip, the tapestry solves the fundamental problem of narrative art: how to represent events that unfold over time on a surface that exists in space, through the device of sequential panels read from left to right, with figures and settings that reappear and transform as the story develops. Like a comic strip, it combines image and text in a relationship that is sometimes redundant, the text saying what the image already shows, and sometimes additive, with image and text each contributing something the other does not. Like a comic strip, it has a vernacular energy, a directness and immediacy that is quite different from the elevated formal qualities of the stone reliefs and mosaic programs of official monumental art. But the comic strip comparison, useful as it is, can also be misleading if it leads us to underestimate the sophistication and deliberateness of what the tapestry is doing. Every compositional choice in the tapestry is meaningful, and the embroiderers, or rather the designer or designers who produced the drawings from which the embroiderers worked, made those choices with a skill and intentionality that rewards very careful looking. The figures, though they follow the conventions of Romanesque art rather than any attempt at naturalistic representation, are remarkably expressive within those conventions. Posture, gesture, the angle of a head, the arrangement of hands, these are used throughout the tapestry to convey emotional states and social relationships with a concision that is genuinely impressive. When Harold swears his oath to William on a pair of holy reliquaries, the oath whose violation William would cite as his justification for the invasion, his body is stretched between the two chests, his hands touching both simultaneously, in a posture of maximum exposure and vulnerability that the designer surely intended as a comment on the scene's moral weight. When the news of Harold's coronation reaches Normandy, William sits receiving the information in a posture that is very still, very controlled, with an attendant leaning in to speak into his ear, and across the frame, a crowd of Normans cluster and point upward at the comet blazing in the border, their bodies animated with an excitement that contrasts sharply with William's stillness. The scene is a masterpiece of composed narrative tension, the calm center and the agitated periphery together conveying the precise emotional weather of the moment. The Tapestry's treatment of the battle itself, which occupies roughly the final third of the surviving length, is among the most vivid and extended depictions of medieval warfare that the period has left us, and it has been studied by military historians with a seriousness that reflects how much genuine information it appears to contain. The Norman army's cavalry, their horses depicted with a kinetic energy that is one of the Tapestry's most immediately striking visual qualities, charge repeatedly against the English infantry holding their position on the ridge at Hastings. The English fight on foot, their shield wall depicted as a dense interlocking line, the shields overlapping in a defensive arrangement that the tapestry represents with remarkable clarity. Below the main register, in the lower border, the dead and wounded accumulate as the battle progresses. Stripped of their armor by scavengers, their bodies arranged in postures of violent death that are handled with a directness that is neither gratuitous nor sanitized but simply, unflinchingly, honest. The border dead are a kind of running commentary on the cost of what the main register is depicting, a reminder that the cavalry charges and tactical maneuvers being shown above are not moves in a game but events in which real people were killed, their bodies left on an English hillside in October while their conquerors rode on toward London. The question of the Tapestry's point of view, whose side it is on, what argument it is making, who it was made for and intended to persuade, has occupied scholars for decades without producing anything like consensus. If it was commissioned by Odo of Bayeux, as most historians believe, then its ultimate purpose was presumably to celebrate the Norman victory and justify William's claim to the English throne. The Latin captions and the visual narrative both present Harold's oath to William as genuine and binding, which makes Harold's acceptance of the English crown after Edward's death an act of perjury and usurpation that gives William's invasion the character of legitimate punishment rather than mere aggression. This is the Norman interpretation of events, and the Tapestry appears to support it. And yet the Tapestry also gives Harold a dignity and a humanity that a purely propagandistic account might have denied him. He is brave, he is shown as loved by his followers. His death, however, it is depicted, the arrow, the knight on horseback cutting him down, the precise sequence of events in the final scene is genuinely unclear, is treated with a gravity that acknowledges what is being lost as well as what is being gained. The Tapestry is, in the end, too human a document to be fully reduced to propaganda. It was made by human hands, stitch by careful stitch, by people who lived in the world that the events it depicts had created, and something of their complex relationship to that world. Their awareness of the cost, their knowledge that history had fallen on people much like themselves, is stitched into it alongside the Latin captions and the leaping horses and the comet blazing over the doomed king's palace. The Tapestry's survival over nearly 1,000 years is itself a story worth briefly telling, because it was far from inevitable. It survived the medieval period intact enough to be recorded in a 1476 inventory of Bayeux Cathedral's treasures, where it is described matter-of-factly as a very long and narrow hanging embroidered with figures and inscriptions representing the conquest of England. It survived the French Revolution, during which it was nearly cut up to cover military wagons before a local official intervened and had it declared public property. Napoleon had it brought to Paris and exhibited, hoping to use its imagery of a successful cross-channel invasion as propaganda for his own planned invasion of England, an invasion that never occurred, leaving the Tapestry as the record of the one that did. It survived the Second World War, during which it was moved repeatedly to protect it from damage, and was examined with considerable interest by Nazi officials who saw in it, somewhat improbably, a work of Germanic cultural heritage. Through all of this it persisted, fading slightly, losing a portion of its original ending, accumulating the small repairs and alterations of many centuries of care, but essentially intact, essentially itself. The same object that English embroiderers made in the years after 1066, the same story told in the same wool on the same linen, still legible, still vivid, still capable of stopping a viewer in their tracks with the sheer accumulated weight of its human detail. It is, in the end, the detail that gets you, not the grand sweep of the narrative, not the historical significance, not the remarkable fact of its survival, but the small, specific things. The man in the lower border carefully removing a boot from a fallen soldier, the cook at the Norman, Camp turning a spit over a fire with the same posture as a cook at any fire in any century, the horses swimming across the border register with their necks stretched and their legs churning, the way Harold's courtiers point upward at the comet, with a mixture of wonder and dread that any human being in any age would recognize. These are the stitches that close the distance of 1,000 years. These are the places where the embroiderers, whoever they were, working in their workshop in Kent in the decades after the world they knew had been overturned, left something of themselves in the record they were making. Not their names, not their faces, not any statement of their own feelings about the events they were depicting, but the evidence of their attention, their observation, their quiet insistence on getting the small human things right even in the middle of the great, historical ones. The tapestry is a record of a conquest. It is also, and perhaps more lastingly, a record of the people who made it, their skill, their patience, their hours, their hands, their needles moving through linen in the service of a story that was not entirely their own, but that they told, in the end, with an honesty and a humanity that belongs to them alone. We have lost in the modern world almost entirely the sense of what a large textile hanging on a stone wall actually does to a room. We have lost it because we no longer live in rooms like those rooms built from stone that was quarried and cut and fitted together without any of the insulating materials that modern construction takes entirely for granted. Rooms where the wind found its way through every gap and joint, where the cold radiated inward from walls that were sometimes a meter thick and yet somehow admitted the winter in ways that thinner, better insulated modern walls do not, where sound moved strangely, bouncing off hard surfaces and returning, in waves that made conversation difficult and ceremony almost impossible to render with the dignity it required. We have lost the sense of what it meant to walk into a great hall that was bare stone, and then to walk into that same hall after tapestries had been hung, and to feel the difference not merely aesthetically but physically, in the temperature of the air, in the quality of the sound, in the way the room seemed to gather itself together into something coherent and bounded and human-scaled in a way that the bare stone version never quite managed. The tapestry, before it was art, was engineering. This is a fact that tends to get lost in discussions that focus on iconography and patronage and artistic influence, all of which are real and important dimensions of the tapestry's history, but none of which capture the immediate, sensory, physical reality of what a large woven hanging did to the spaces it occupied. Stone is one of the worst insulating materials known to architecture. It absorbs cold readily and releases it slowly, which means that a stone wall in winter is not merely cold to the touch but actively radiating coldness into the room it encloses, acting as a heat sink that draws warmth away from any fire or body heat that the room's occupants generate. A great medieval hall or throne room before the hanging of tapestries was in practical terms nearly uninhabitable during the winter months, a space in which fires could be maintained and furs could be piled on and still the cold came through, the walls with a persistence that no amount of burning wood could entirely defeat. The hanging of tapestries against those walls created an air gap between the cloth and the stone, a thin buffer of trapped air that provided meaningful insulation, and the wool of the tapestry itself added another layer of thermal resistance. The room became not warm exactly by modern standards, but warmer, livably warmer, functionally warmer, warmer in the way that made the difference between a space where ceremony and governance and the ordinary business of power could be conducted, and a space where you simply endured until you could go somewhere else. Sound worked differently too behind the tapestries. Stone rooms are acoustically brutal. Sound waves reflect from hard surfaces with very little absorption, producing reverberation times that can turn a spoken sentence into an unintelligible blur, that make music strange and overlapping, that amplify certain frequencies in ways that are deeply uncomfortable and suppress others in ways that are equally disorienting. Anyone who has stood in an unfurnished stone room of any size and tried to hold a conversation knows the quality of this acoustic environment. The way words pile up on each other, the way the room seems to be speaking simultaneously from every direction, the way intimacy and clarity both become almost impossible to achieve. Wool is among the most effective natural acoustic absorbing materials that exist. Its fiber structure, with its microscopic scales and its complex three-dimensional crimp, dissipates sound energy with remarkable efficiency, converting the kinetic energy of sound waves into tiny amounts of heat through friction within the fiber mass. A room hung with heavy wool tapestries on multiple walls is a room transformed acoustically. The reverberation time drops significantly. The overlapping reflections are absorbed before they can accumulate into the muddy blur of the bare stone room, and the human voice recovers its clarity and its directionality. Speech becomes speech again, rather than an echo of itself. The room becomes a place where language can do its work. These two practical functions, thermal insulation and acoustic management, were never understood in the technical terms we would now use to describe them, but they were understood empirically and completely. The people who decided to hang tapestries in great halls and throne rooms and royal bedchambers knew, because they lived in these spaces and felt the difference with their own bodies, exactly what the tapestries were doing. They knew the room was warmer. They knew they could hear each other more clearly. They knew that the ceremonies performed in tapestried rooms had a different quality from ceremonies performed in bare stone rooms. A quality of presence and focus and dignity that the bare stone room, for all its impressiveness of scale, could not achieve. And because they knew these things, and because knowledge in the medieval and ancient worlds did not always separate itself into the neat categories of practical and symbolic, functional and meaningful, that we have learned to maintain, they understood the tapestry's practical effects as part of its meaning rather than separate from it. The warmth the tapestry gave was not merely physical warmth. The clarity it lent to the spoken word was not merely acoustic clarity. These were manifestations of the tapestry's power to transform space, to take raw, unmediated stone and convert it into something human and ordered and fit for the exercise of authority and the conduct of sacred ceremony. The tapestry made the room inhabitable. And to make a space truly inhabitable in the full sense of that word was in ancient and medieval thinking a sacred act. This understanding of the tapestry as a sacred boundary marker, as an object that did not merely decorate a space but consecrated it, drawing a line between the ordered world of the court or the temple and the disordered world beyond, runs deep in the history of nearly every culture that developed sophisticated textile traditions. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that the Israelites carried through the wilderness during the Exodus, was fundamentally a textile structure. Its walls were formed by large woven hangings of linen worked in blue, purple, and crimson yarns, colors that carried the full weight of sacred and royal association that those dyes commanded throughout the ancient Near East. The inner curtain of the tabernacle, the veil that separated the outer sanctuary from the innermost chamber known as the Holy of Holies, the space within the space, the sacred center of the sacred center, was itself a textile, a woven curtain of exceptional quality and symbolic complexity. To pass through that curtain was to cross a boundary between the human and the divine, and the curtain marked that boundary not with stone or metal but with cloth, with the organized and intentional beauty of woven thread. The textile was the threshold. It was the membrane between worlds. This function of the textile as threshold, as boundary marker, as the material that defined the edge of the sacred, appears with striking consistency across cultures that had no direct contact with each other. In the great Hindu temple complexes of South and Southeast Asia, elaborately embroidered and woven textiles were and continue to be used to dress the cult images of the gods, to hang above the doorways of the inner sanctum, to mark the boundaries of the most sacred spaces in ways that distinguish them from the merely consecrated or the merely impressive spaces of the outer precincts. To cross under a textile threshold is to move into a different quality of space, a space where the ordinary rules of the profane world are suspended and the presence of the divine is more immediately felt. The textile boundary is permeable in a way that a stone wall is not. It moves in the air. It responds to the passage of bodies through the doorway. It has a quality of living responsiveness that stone permanently denies, and this permeability is part of its sacred meaning. A stone wall says, "You shall not pass." A textile threshold says, "You may pass." But in passing, you are changed. You are entering somewhere that will require something different of you than the place you have just left. In the throne rooms of medieval Europe, this sacred dimension of the tapestry was deployed with a sophistication and a deliberateness that we can read clearly in the visual evidence that survives. The great Flemish and later Flemish and French tapestries produced in the workshops of Arras, Tournai, Brussels, and later the royal workshop of the Gobelins in Paris were hung in the audience chambers and throne rooms of European royalty not merely because they were beautiful, though they were extraordinarily beautiful, but because they did specific rhetorical and political work in those spaces. They told stories drawn from classical mythology, from the Old and New Testaments, from chivalric romance, from history, that framed the ruler seated in front of them within a narrative of heroism and divine sanction. The king, who received ambassadors in a room hung with tapestries showing the labors of Hercules, was not merely sitting in a decorated room. He was placing himself, visually and symbolically, within a tradition of heroic achievement that linked his own authority to the greatest of classical heroes. The king who received visitors beneath tapestries depicting the life of Solomon was asserting, in the most visually immediate and unavoidable way possible, a connection between his own exercise of wisdom and judgment and the divinely sanctioned wisdom of the most celebrated king of the Hebrew tradition. This rhetorical dimension of the tapestry as throne room furnishing was understood and exploited by European rulers with a tactical intelligence that is sometimes breathtaking in its ambition and its specificity. When Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, commissioned his great tapestry series depicting the history of Alexander the Great in the mid-15th century, he was making a claim about his own historical significance and his own military prowess. That was clear to every contemporary observer who saw those tapestries hanging in his great halls. Alexander was the supreme example, in the medieval imagination, of the conqueror who bent the entire world to his will, and Philip, whose Burgundian state at its height controlled territory stretching from the North Sea to the borders of Switzerland, and whose wealth and cultural ambition made his court the most spectacular in northern Europe, was positioning himself as Alexander's contemporary heir. The tapestries were the argument. They were hung in the spaces where the argument needed to be made most forcefully, in the audience chambers where visiting rulers and ambassadors would be received, where the visual environment was carefully managed to produce maximum impressions of Burgundian power and cultural supremacy. To sit in Philip's great hall and look at Alexander's conquests reproduced in wool and silk and gold thread on every wall was to understand, without any spoken word being necessary, exactly what kind of court you were visiting and exactly what kind of man you were dealing with. The use of precious materials in tapestry production was itself a dimension of this rhetorical deployment of textile wealth. The finest medieval and Renaissance tapestries were woven not only in wool and linen but with threads of real gold and real silver, metal-wrapped threads that caught the light of candles and torches in ways that transformed the surface of the tapestry from something merely colorful into something that seemed to glow with its own internal luminosity. In a world where artificial light was always scarce, expensive, and modest in its intensity, this optical effect was genuinely extraordinary. A great throne room hung with gold-threaded tapestries, lit by dozens of candles and torches, would have appeared to any contemporary observer as a space of almost supernatural brilliance, a space that seemed to transcend the limitations of ordinary illuminated rooms in ways that were immediately and physically registered as significant. The gold thread in the tapestry was not merely expensive, though its expense was itself communicative. It was luminous in a way that connected the tapestried throne room to the iconographic tradition of the gold-ground paintings and mosaics of Byzantine and early Christian art, in which the gold background of sacred images was understood to represent the uncreated light of the divine realm, the light that existed before the creation of the sun and that would exist after the material world had passed away. To hang gold-threaded tapestries in a throne room was to import something of this divine luminosity into the space of earthly power, to suggest that the authority exercised there was not merely political but sacred, not merely human but touched, by the same light that surrounded the saints in their golden heavens. The portable nature of tapestries added another dimension to their power that fixed architectural decoration could never achieve. Stone murals and mosaic programs, however magnificent, stayed where they were built. Tapestries traveled. The great rulers of medieval Europe moved constantly between their various residences, and their tapestries moved with them, packed into crates and carried on carts and unrolled and hung in whatever space the court was currently occupying. This meant that the rhetoric of the tapestry, the claims it made about the power and sanctity and historical significance of its owner, was not fixed to any single location, but could be deployed wherever the ruler went, transforming any sufficiently large room into a throne room, any sufficiently large hall into a space of ceremony and authority simply by the act of hanging the appropriate textiles on its walls. The tapestry was, in this sense, a portable sovereignty, a packaged version of the visual and environmental argument for royal authority that could be assembled and disassembled as required, carried into enemy territory or diplomatic meeting, ground or newly inherited castle, and used to establish immediately and unmistakably the nature of the power that had arrived. The room the tapestries made was the room power required. And so the tapestry hanging in the throne room was always doing several things simultaneously, all of them real, all of them essential, none of them fully separable from the others. It was warming the room. It was quieting it, making it fit for the voices of authority to be heard clearly and with dignity. It was telling a story that placed the ruler within a tradition of heroism and divine sanction. It was marking the space as sacred, as set apart from the ordinary world, as a threshold between the merely human and the touched by power. It was demonstrating, in the most immediate and sensory way possible, the wealth of its owner. Wealth, measured not in gold hoarded in a treasury, but in the accumulated labor hours of hundreds of skilled workers, weavers and dyers and designers and finishers who had spent months or years of their working lives producing this object and whose invisible labor was hanging on the wall for every visitor to experience without necessarily understanding the full depth of what they were experiencing. The tapestry said, "This place has been made ready for you. This place has been transformed from stone into something warmer and more ordered and more beautiful than stone. This transformation was accomplished by wealth, and wealth is power, and power, when it is exercised with sufficient skill and sufficient ambition, becomes something that it is not entirely wrong to call the divine working through human hands and human thread. There is a rhythm at the heart of weaving that is older than music, older than prayer, older than any of the formal practices that human beings have developed over the millennia for the purpose of quieting the mind and returning the self to something more fundamental than the noise of daily existence. It is not a complex rhythm. It is perhaps the simplest rhythm that intentional human action can produce. A rhythm of two, of back and forth, of pass and return, of the shuttle moving in one direction through the shed of warp threads, and then, after the beater has pressed, the new row firmly into place, moving back again in the other. Pass and beat. Pass and beat. Left and right. Forward and back. It is the rhythm of breathing, of walking, of the heart, of waves coming in and going out on a shore that has been receiving them since long before any human being stood on it to listen. The loom did not invent this rhythm. It found it, recognized it, gave it a material form and a productive purpose, and in doing so created one of the most quietly powerful meditative technologies that the human species has ever stumbled upon. We tend to think of meditation as something that requires a particular posture, a particular setting, a particular orientation of the self toward stillness and toward silence. We think of it as the deliberate cessation of activity, the conscious withdrawal from the demands of the world, the careful and intentional cultivation of a mental state that is different from the mental state of ordinary waking life. This understanding of meditation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It reflects a particular tradition of contemplative practice. Broadly speaking, the tradition of seated, eyes-closed, breath-focused meditation that has its roots in the ascetic and monastic cultures of South and East Asia, and that has, in recent decades, been extracted from those cultural contexts and offered to the modern world as a secular technique for stress reduction and cognitive enhancement. This is a real and valuable tradition. But it is not the only tradition, and it is not the oldest tradition, and it does not exhaust the range of human experience that deserves to be called meditative. The older tradition, the tradition that precedes, by many thousands of years any formal school of contemplative practice is the tradition of work. Specifically, it is the tradition of repetitive manual work performed with sufficient skill and sufficient familiarity that the conscious, problem-solving, planning, worrying mind is not needed to supervise it. Work that the hands can do largely, on their own. Work that has a rhythm built into its structure that the body learns and follows the way the body follows the rhythm of breathing, without effort and without decision. This is not the exhausted, numbing repetition of work that is too simple and too mechanical to engage any part of the human being, the kind of repetition that degrades and diminishes. It is something more subtle and more interesting than that. It is the repetition of work that is complex enough to require attention, skilled enough to have taken time to learn, variable enough to offer the mind small puzzles and small pleasures within its larger rhythmic structure, but familiar enough that the executive functions of the brain, the planning, the deciding, the monitoring, can step back from their usual supervisory role and allow the more embodied, more automatic, more ancient parts of the nervous system to take over. The neuroscientists have a name for what happens in this state. They call it the default mode network, the pattern of brain activity that emerges when the directed, task-focused executive attention of the prefrontal cortex relaxes its grip and the brain shifts into a different mode of operation, one that is associated with mind-wandering and daydreaming and the kind of loose associative thinking that is often the source of genuine creative insight and genuine emotional integration. The ancient weavers did not have this language, but they had the experience every working day of their lives, and they knew it for what it was.
To sit at a loom and begin to weave, when you are a weaver who has been weaving for years and whose hands know the work the way a musician's hands know a scale, is to enter this state almost immediately. The setting up of the loom, the warping, the threading of the heddles, the sleeing of the reed. These are tasks that require concentration and care, tasks where a mistake made in inattention can mean hours of painstaking correction, or even the unthreading and rethreading of the entire warp. But the weaving itself, once the loom is set up and the pattern is established, and the shuttle has found its rhythm, is different in quality from the setting up. The hands know what to do, the feet know when to press which treadle. The eye monitors the fell of the cloth, and the tension of the warp with the peripheral, relaxed attention of long familiarity, rather than the focused, anxious attention of the learner, and the mind, released from the necessity of directing each individual motion, begins to move in its own way, following its own currents, drifting through memory and sensation in the half-formed thoughts that rarely have the space to develop in the busier, more directed moments of ordinary waking life. This quality of the meditative state that weaving induces is not the blankness or the emptiness that some descriptions of meditation emphasize. It is not the suppression of thought, but the liberation of a particular kind of thought. Slow, wandering, imagistic, emotionally resonant, not directed toward any goal, but moving through the interior landscape of the mind, with the gentle purposelessness of a river finding its own way through flat country. Psychologists who study the default mode network have found that this mode of brain activity is associated with narrative self-processing, with the brain's ongoing work of integrating experience into the story of the self, making sense of what has happened and how it fits with what is known and what is hoped for and what is feared. This is, in other words, the brain doing some of its most important emotional and psychological work, and it tends to do this work precisely in the moments when the directed demands of a task have been reduced to a level that the automatic systems can handle, the loom. In creating exactly these conditions was not merely a cloth-producing machine. It was a machine for creating the conditions in which human beings could quietly, productively, without any formal therapeutic intention, process the contents of their own inner lives. In the ancient world, where formal therapeutic structures did not exist and where the interior life was understood through frameworks of ritual and cosmology rather than psychology, this processing function of repetitive work was recognized and valued without being theorized in any of the ways we might reach for now. It was recognized simply as a quality of the work, as something that weavers and spinners and potters and woodcarvers and all the other practitioners of slow, rhythmic, skilled handwork knew from the inside as a characteristic of their craft. In many cultures, this quality was understood as a form of communion with the materials, with the ancestors who had taught the craft, with the divine forces that were understood to move through and animate the natural world. The Navajo weaving tradition of the American Southwest, one of the most elaborately theorized weaving traditions in the world, understands the act of weaving as a fundamentally sacred activity, a participation in the ongoing creative work of the universe. In Navajo cosmology, the spider, specifically the mythological figure of Spider Woman, who taught the first human beings to weave, is a divine creator, and the loom is a cosmic structure. The warp sticks are the earth and the sky. The warp threads are rain. The heddles are made of sun rays and rock crystal and shell. To weave is to participate in the structure of the cosmos, to enact in miniature the same creative process by which the universe itself was made and continues to be maintained. The rhythmic action of the weaver's hands is not separate from the rhythmic processes of the natural world, but continuous with them, an expression of the same fundamental ordering impulse that makes the seasons return and the rain fall and the seeds sprout. This understanding of weaving as cosmic participation, as an activity that connects the human being to something larger than the individual self, is not unique to the Navajo tradition. It appears in various forms in weaving cultures across the world and across history. In ancient Greece, the Fates, the Moirai, were weavers, spinning and measuring and cutting the thread of each human life. In Norse mythology, the Norns performed the same function at the base of the world tree Yggdrasil, weaving the fate of gods and mortals on a loom whose warp threads were stretched between the worlds. In both traditions, the fundamental metaphor is the same. Life is a thread, fate is a weave, and the great rhythmic work of the cosmos proceeds by the same logic as the work of the loom, the accumulation of individual crossings, individual moments, into a pattern that can only be seen from a sufficient distance and that reveals its meaning only in the completed whole. For the human weaver sitting at her loom and passing the shuttle back and forth in the familiar rhythm of her daily work, this mythological framework was not an abstract philosophical proposition but a lived experience made available through the act of weaving itself. She was, in her own small way, doing what the Fates did. She was taking individual threads and bringing them into ordered relationship, creating structure from chaos, making something durable and meaningful from the loose and perishable materials of the natural world. The cosmic resonance of this work was not merely poetic. It was, within the cosmological framework she inhabited, literally true. The silence in which ancient weavers worked was itself a significant element of the meditative quality of the craft. Not absolute silence in a workshop with several looms. The sound of the work itself was continuous. The sound of the work itself was continuous. The rhythmic thump of the beater against the fell of the cloth, the soft hiss of the shuttle through the shed, the creak of the loom's frame under the tension of the warp. But these were not the sounds of conversation or commerce or the demanding social world of the marketplace and the street. They were the sounds of the work itself and the street. They were the sounds of the work itself, rhythmic and repetitive, and gradually absorbed into the background of awareness the way the sound of rain is absorbed. Present but no longer individually perceived. Present but no longer individually perceived, forming instead a kind of auditory environment that is simultaneously stimulating and soothing. The contemporary neuroscience of auditory perception has a name for this too. It is called habituation, the process by which the brain, after sufficient exposure to a repeated stimulus, reduces its attentional response to that stimulus and allows it to recede from foreground perception into background. The sounds of the loom habituate quickly because they are regular and predictable, and once they have habituated, they form a kind of acoustic cocoon around the weaver, a sound environment that is familiar and safe, and that marks the space of the work as different and quality from the noisier, more unpredictable sound environments of the outside world. This acoustic cocoon, combined with the physical rhythm of the work and the gentle withdrawal of executive attention that the familiar task permits, creates conditions that are remarkably close to those that modern sleep researchers identify as optimal for the transition from waking to sleep. The reduction of novel sensory stimulation, the presence of rhythmic and predictable sound, the relaxation of directed cognitive effort, the warmth generated by physical activity in an enclosed space. All of these are conditions that the brain interprets as signals that it is safe to reduce its state of arousal, safe to begin the transition toward the lower frequency brain states. that characterized drowsiness and sleep. Ancient weavers did not, of course, fall asleep at their looms. The work required enough attention to prevent that, and the social context of workshop weaving provided enough ambient social stimulation to maintain wakefulness. But they moved, during the hours of their work, through a range of mental states that bordered on the hypnagogic, the threshold state between waking and sleeping, where the mind is relaxed enough to produce the loose, imagistic, emotionally resonant thinking of dreams without having entirely relinquished its connection to the waking world. It is perhaps this quality, this ability to carry the human mind gently and reliably to the edges of sleep, without quite crossing over, that is the loom's most quietly profound gift to the human experience. Not the cloth it produced, magnificent and essential as that cloth was. Not the social function it served, bringing women together in shared productive labor. Not the economic importance of its output or the aesthetic achievement of its finest products, but this, the reliable, daily, embodied practice of an activity that, he carried the practitioner, as naturally and as gently as a river carries a leaf, toward the quieter reaches of the mind, toward the places where the noise of ordinary thinking recedes, and something older and softer takes its place, toward the warm, dim, rhythmic interior where the self, released from its usual duties of planning and monitoring and worrying, can simply drift, can rest, can, without any formal intention or any deliberate technique, arrive at something very like peace. Tonight, as you let these words settle and feel the weight of the day beginning to lift, consider the weavers, consider the women and men who sat at their looms in the firelit rooms of the ancient world, their hands moving in the rhythm that their bodies had long since made automatic, their minds wandering in the loose and pleasant way that the work permitted and even encouraged. They did not know they were meditating. They did not have a word for what the rhythm of the loom was doing to their nervous systems, for the way the pass and beat and pass of the shuttle was gently, steadily, reliably walking them back from the agitated surface of waking life towards something calmer and more fundamental. They simply knew that weaving felt a certain way, that there was a quality to the hours at the loom that was different from other hours, softer and more inward, that time passed differently there, that the mind moved differently there, that by the end of a long day at the loom, there was a tiredness that was also a satisfaction, a quietness of the body, and the spirit that was one of the better feelings that daily life reliably offered. They knew this the way the body always knows what is good for it, before the mind has found the language to explain why. They knew it in their hands, in the familiar weight of the shuttle, in the slight resistance of the warped threads against the passing weft, in this slow accumulation of new cloth on the beam, in front of them, row by patient row, hour by quiet hour, the pattern building itself in the ancient rhythm of over and under, pass and beat, back and forth, the simplest motion in the world, lo, of simplest motion in the world, the motion that the universe itself has always made, the motion that carries everything, in the end, toward rest. Sweet dreams, history travelers. If these quiet stories help you find sleep, subscribe, and we'll be here waiting with more whenever the night calls.